A waiter told a Latino family they didn't belong in a fancy restaurant. What Chuck Norris did. Next left everyone stunned. The Rivera family stepped through the restaurant's arched doorway, the gentle chime of the entrance bell announcing their arrival. Marco's heart swelled with pride as he saw La Belle Vi's polished mahogany bar gleam under amber lights. Elena paused in the foyer, smoothing her embroidered shawl and taking in the flowering vines that crawled up stone columns. Sophia and Diego trailed behind, eyes wide with excitement and a hint of nervous wonder. This was the first time they'd shared a meal in a place so grand. Take a second to subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Now back to the story. A staff member approached, offering menus printed on heavy cream paper. Marco thanked her in English, then added in Spanish, "We'd love the chef's specialties." Elena leaned closer to the children. "Tonight is to celebrate Papa's new position," she whispered. Sophia looked up at her father, whose promotion had come after years of long hours and sacrifice. Diego, clutching his sister's hand, grinned broadly at the promise of something special. They were guided past linen-covered tables set with crystal glasses and flickering votive candles. The soft murmur of other diners and faint strains of a piano created a warm hum. Elena inhaled the subtle scent of rosemary and olive oil drifting from the open kitchen. Sophia's gaze traveled over elegant wine racks lining a far wall. Diego tugged at Marco's sleeve and pointed at a framed painting of a vineyard bathed in sunset. At the table, the maitre d' pulled out chairs and nodded courteously. Marco slid Elena's chair back so she could sit. She offered a gentle smile and thanks. Sophia and Diego settled into theirs, immediately folding their napkins in their laps. Marco placed his hand on Elena's and said, "To us." She nodded, her eyes shining. Sophia tugged Marco's sleeve. "Can we have tres leches cake, Papa?" she asked in a hushed tone. Elena exchanged a look with Marco. "Later," he promised, raising an eyebrow at the children. They both laughed softly, the sound mingling with the clink of glasses. The family sat poised, anticipation rippling through them like the soft glow of candlelight. They were exactly where they belonged, at least that's what they hoped. The waiter approached with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was tall and lean, dressed in crisp black trousers and a starched white shirt, his dark hair combed back neatly. As he set down the menus, his gaze flicked over the Rivera family's folded napkins and back to their faces, lingering just long enough for Elena to feel a flicker of unease. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth. "Welcome to La Belle Vie. May I begin you with some wine recommendations?" Marco glanced at Elena, then at the children before replying. "A bottle of your finest Malbec, please." The waiter's lips curved ever so slightly, as if tasting the request for the first time. He left and returned moments later with the wine, his movements precise. As he uncorked the bottle and poured a taste for Marco, his eyes darted briefly to Sophia and Diego. Elena watched him closely. His service felt efficient but distant. When he recited the evening's specials, seared scallops with saffron broth, slow-cooked lamb shank with rosemary juice, his tone conveyed expertise, yet something in his posture suggested he was sizing them up. The Riveras exchanged excited glances. Marco leaned forward to ask about the chef's special garnish, and the waiter paused, head tilting as if surprised by genuine curiosity. He answered, with measured courtesy, but did not volunteer more than necessary. What he offered to explain the tasting menu in Spanish. Elena smiled graciously. His brow furrowed for a heartbeat, then cleared as he switched to her native tongue. With each dish he described, the waiter maintained an undercurrent of reserve. He placed bread baskets on the table, fluffing each roll with deft fingers, then excused himself. Sophia whispered to Diego, "He sounds nice, but he seems quiet." Diego nodded, eyeing the waiter as he moved on. Marco raised his glass. "To new experiences," he toasted, the snowflake of condensation on the wine catching the candlelight. Elena sipped, savoring the smooth fruit flavor, then smiled at her husband. Around them, other tables buzzed with soft conversation. The waiter paused at a nearby station, arms crossed, watching. In that moment, the Rivera family sensed that beneath the polished service lay something more complex, an invisible barrier they had yet to understand. The waiter slipped into the kitchen, shoulders straight, mask back in place. As he passed the swinging door, he muttered under his breath, "They don't belong." Chef Laurent halted mid stir, tongs poised over a sauté pan. His brow nodded. "It's just my feeling," the waiter whispered, glancing around to ensure no diners overheard. "They stand out. Too much color, too many questions." The chef set aside his pan. "Our job is to serve everyone," he said quietly. "You forget that, you forget why we're here." Back at the table, the Rivera family was settling into their appetizers, fresh guacamole with house-made chips, shrimp ceviche bright with lime and cilantro. Elena dipped a chip and offered it to Diego. He smiled, but his eyes flickered toward the kitchen door, as if sensing the tension beyond. The waiter reappeared, depositing their dishes with care, but without greeting them directly. His back was turned. When he finally faced them, his expression was polite but impersonal. Sophia frowned slightly. "Did he just leave without saying anything?" she asked under her breath. Marco cleared his throat softly. "Service can be busy tonight. Let's enjoy." He lifted a chip and took a bite, hoping to steer the mood back to warmth. Elena nodded, but her gaze kept drifting to the open kitchen. Through the widening gap, she caught a glimpse of the waiter's jaw, tightening as he spoke to a line cook. The cook's shoulders slumped in reply. A waitress passed, carrying a tray of flutes filled with sparkling wine. She paused at another table, leaning in to chat with a couple. Laughter bubbled from their corner. Across the room, the wait staff clustered near the service station, exchanging low murmurs. Sophia leaned closer to her parents. "Do you think they're talking about us?" she whispered. Elena wrapped an arm around her daughter. "Let's focus on each other," she replied, voice steady though her heart raced. As the waiter approached again, this time to pour water, his hand hovered over Elena's glass. Before he withdrew, he placed the pitcher on the table's edge and stepped back, gaze flicking to the couple across from them. The family shared a tight smile, determined to savor the evening. But beneath the candle's glow, an undercurrent of scrutiny coursed through the dining room, unseen yet powerfully felt. The waiter paused at a nearby station, then returned with the water pitcher. He set it down, deliberately at Sophia's elbow, leaving Diego's glass nearly empty. Elena hesitated before lifting the pitcher and filling her daughter's glass, the waiter already stepping away before filling Marco's. He offered a curt nod and moved on to attend other tables, where he refilled glasses. Without hesitation, Sophia exchanged a glance with her brother and reached across to top off Diego's glass herself. "Thanks, Mama," he whispered, relief shining in his eyes. Marco cleared his throat and called for the waiter's attention, but the man slipped past them, feigning busyness. When Marco flagged him again, the waiter stopped mid-stride, glanced at the table, and responded in clipped sentences. "Still waiting on any questions about tonight's specials?" he asked without pausing, as if eager to depart. Elena smiled politely. "Yes. Could you tell us more about the lamb shank preparation?" The waiter nodded once, lips tight. He rattled off the basics: rosemary, red wine reduction, then turned to leave, shoulders squared. His back felt distant, as though a wall stood between him and the Rivera family. Throughout the next course, the waiter's subtle coldness persisted. He passed by without making eye contact, refilled other diners' bread baskets, yet left theirs untouched. When Elena reached for another roll, she found the basket empty and looked up to catch his gaze. He was already moving away. She folded her napkin and leaned toward Marco. "Shall I ask for more?" Marco met her eyes. "Not worth it," he murmured. Their food arrived perfectly timed, but delivered mechanically, without warmth. Sophia nudged her mother. I feel like we're invisible. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. Or unwelcome, she whispered back, voice low. They ate, with polite smiles, tasting fine flavors overshadowed by an invisible chill. In the soft glow of candlelight, the Rivera family realized that in this elegant room, true hospitality was reserved. For some, but not for them. Elena traced the rim of her wine glass, studying the liquid's deep garnet hue as it caught the candlelight. She felt a twist in her chest, a quiet alarm that something was off beyond simple inattentiveness. Across the table, Marco chatted with Sophia about her school play, but Elena's smiles felt practiced. She caught sight of Paul, the waiter, leaning at the service station, arms crossed, eyes fixed on their table. He offered a brief nod to a colleague, but never looked their way again. Elena forced herself to eat a bite of the lamb shank, but the rich, tender meat felt hollow on her tongue. A soft clang from the kitchen made her start. She brushed a wisp of hair behind her ear and focused on Diego, who was carefully cutting his chicken. He glanced up, then looked back, down, shoulders slumping as if he, too, sensed the tension. Elena cleared her throat and spoke, louder than she intended. This was such a special evening. I want you both to remember it. Fondly, Sophia's eyes flickered with worry. It'll be fine, Mama. Diego offered a small, brave smile. Elena nodded, but as she reached for her water glass, it sat empty. Reflexively, she raised her eyes to the station. The pitcher had been whisked away. Excuse me, she called, voice steady. The waiter paused mid-step, glanced at her, then turned away without a word. Elena's heart pounded. She set her glass down and took a slow breath, letting it out in a whisper. Marco reached for her hand beneath the table, squeezing gently. Elena glanced at him, eyes wide. He offered a reassuring nod, but said nothing. Elena forced herself to pick at the side of her plate, pretending interest in the rosemary juice. Yet, every time she looked up, she saw Paul standing too close to the host podium, exchanging quiet words with Mrs. Langley. Elena pressed her lips together, straightening in her chair. She thought of the celebration, of Marco's promotion, of the laughter they'd shared before arriving. The thought of leaving this restaurant with only half the joy they'd intended twisted her stomach. Elena inhaled deeply, summoning calm. She would see this through, for her family, and for the evening they deserved. But beneath her composed exterior, unease rippled, like a hidden current waiting to break free. Marco leaned back as the sommelier approached another table, presenting a taste of a rare vintage. Encouraged, he called out, "Could we try a small pour as well?" The room's soft chatter dimmed briefly. The waiter, Paul, hovered at the edge of earshot. He stepped forward with a forced smile. "Sir, with all due respect, this table is reserved for our VIP guests. I'm afraid you must have made a mistake." His tone was polite but rigid. Marco's smile faltered. Elena sat up straighter, hand tightening around her napkin. Paul's words hung in the air. Other diners glanced over. Forks paused in midair, eyes curious. A woman across the room nudged her partner, whispering something that made him turn and look. The Rivera children exchanged nervous glances, their celebratory mood evaporating. "I believe you misunderstand," Marco said, voice steady but firm. "We booked this table weeks ago. Here's the confirmation." He slid his phone across the table, screen lit to the reservation. "Email." Paul glanced at it, brow furrowing, but did not apologize. Instead, he swept back his arm. "I'm sorry, but I must insist." Elena's cheeks flushed. She rose slowly, smoothing her shawl. "Please," she said quietly, "we simply wish to enjoy the wine selection like any other guests." Paul glanced toward the maitre d', who stood by, arms folded. The maitre d' offered a hollow nod as though complicit. Paul returned his gaze to the Riveras. "Our policy," he said, voice low, enough for only them to hear. "We can't accommodate special requests from parties we didn't pre-screen." Across the room, The couple who had spoken earlier looked on, uncertainty in their posture. The sommelier hovered in the background, hands clasped. Silence pressed in around the Rivera family, loud as thunder. Sophia's lower lip trembled. Diego reached for his sister's hand. Marco took a steadying breath. "This family belongs here," he said, voice calm but ringing with conviction. His words cut through the hush, drawing every pair of eyes. Paul's expression flickered, surprise, discomfort, before he managed a curt bow and stepped back. Elena sank back in her chair, trembling. The restaurant's air felt colder now, charged by the public snub. Yet as the waiter retreated, the Riveras met each other's eyes, solidarity hardening. In the wake of humiliation, the Riveras sat in a sudden stillness, the clatter of cutlery and distant laughter now a sharp contrast to the tight silence around their table. Elena's hand hovered over her glass, the wine's surface trembling as she finally took a deliberate sip. Marco folded his napkin, then unfolded it. His jaw set. Sophia stared at her plate, tracing the rim with her fork, her shoulders hunched. Diego's foot tapped the floor under the table, a rapid, nervous rhythm. Elena cleared her throat and offered a gentle smile. "How is everyone's meal?" she asked, voice soft but deliberate. Sophia managed a small nod. "It's delicious," Diego echoed her, adding, "Everything tastes good." Marco glanced at the children, then back at Elena. "Shall we focus on that?" he suggested. Elena nodded, pressing her palms flat against the table to steady herself. She reached for a piece of bread, tearing it with quiet determination. Across the table, Sophia tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, determination flickering in her eyes. They began to eat again, but the tension lingered like a shadow. Marco leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We'll finish our dinner and leave with our heads held high." Elena exhaled, slowly, and picked up her fork. From the corner of her eye, Elena noticed Paul at the station, arms folded, body angled toward them. He exchanged a glance with the maitre d', whose lips tightened in disapproval. Elena's grip on her fork tightened, knuckles whitening. Sophia cleared her throat. "Papa, can we please order dessert?" she asked, voice shaky but hopeful. Marco looked to Elena. She gave a slight nod, and he caught the waiter's attention. With a calm raise of his hand, Paul approached, expression neutral. "What would you like?" he asked, words clipped. Sophia lifted her gaze. "Tres leches cake, please," Diego added, "and maybe some fruit sorbet." Paul's eyes flicked to Marco as if seeking approval. Marco simply nodded. The waiter turned and walked away without acknowledgement, leaving the request lingering in the charged air. Elena met her husband's eyes. He offered a reassuring smile, the first genuine warmth since they'd arrived. Sophia and Diego inhaled, bracing for rejection, but finding instead a quiet resolve taking root. Though the restaurant's cold glance weighed on them, the Riveras were determined not to let it break their bond or their celebration. Marco set down his fork with deliberate calm and rose from his chair. Elena reached for his hand, but he gently shook his head, an unspoken promise to resolve this. He cleared his throat, voice steady as he called across the room, "Paul." The waiter paused mid-step, turning slowly. Marco spoke so that nearby diners could hear without shouting. "I'd like to understand why our family has been treated differently this evening." He folded his arms, gaze unwavering. Paul's jaw tightened. He swallowed. "I asked you for water," Marco continued, "and watched you walk away. I requested wine, recommendations, only to be told we didn't belong here. Is there a reason for this?" His tone was firm yet measured. No anger, only clarity. Paul's eyes flicked toward the maitre d', who remained silent, arms crossed. Marco met Paul's gaze directly. "I have confirmation of our reservation and payment. If there's any issue, I'd appreciate honesty." Paul hesitated, face pale under the restaurant's soft lights. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. A hush fell. Other tables glanced over, forks paused. Elena's breath caught. Sophia tensed, and Diego's fingers dug into his napkin. At last, Paul's shoulders slumped. He drew a slow breath. I'm sorry, he began, voice low. It was unprofessional. You're right. You deserve to be here. His gaze dropped to the floor, shame coloring his words. Marco allowed a moment of silence before nodding once. Thank you, he said quietly. An apology is a start. I hope from here on, you'll treat us and all guests with the respect every patron deserves. Paul straightened, eyes lifting to meet Marco's. Yes, sir, he replied, voice steadier. He stepped back and motioned toward their table. May I refill your glasses? Marco nodded. As Paul moved to serve, Elena exhaled, relief and pride mingling. The confrontation had brought the undercurrents to the surface, and in doing so, reclaimed their evening. The kitchen door swung open behind the service station, and Paul stepped inside, face drawn. Chef Laurent, sous chef Damien, and two line cooks paused as the door swung closed behind him. The clatter of pans and sizzling of sauces fell silent in the sudden hush. Paul's shoulders curved inward as he leaned against the counter. He began, voice wavering. I treated a table poorly tonight. Chef Laurent set down his ladle and crossed his arms. Which table? He asked, calm but firm. Paul swallowed. The Rivera family at table 12. Damien exchanged a glance with a line cook, eyebrows raised. Laurent inhaled, then exhaled slowly. Explain. Paul rubbed his palms on his apron. I thought they stood out. I made assumptions. I told them they didn't belong. I was rude, dismissive. Their host called me out. His voice cracked. Damien shook his head. That's not why we're here. We serve food, not prejudice. The line cook, arms folded, added, and we've got guests depending on our professionalism. Laurent stepped closer to Paul, voice low. You forgot your training and your humanity. You need to do better. Paul's eyes filled. Laurent studied him for a moment. I'll speak with Mrs. Langley about this, but you'll apologize. Formally, tonight, to the family and the floor staff. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. And you'll complete sensitivity training next week. Paul's eyes darted down. Yes, chef. Damien laid a hand on Paul's shoulder. We all slip up. What matters is how you own it and learn. The line cook nodded. We back you when you do right. Laurent straightened. Get back out there. Finish the night with respect and excellence. Paul swallowed and squared his shoulders, gripping the edge of the counter. As he turned toward the kitchen door, Laurent called after him. Remember why you chose this profession, to bring people together through food. Paul paused, then nodded once and stepped back into the dining room. The hum of service resumed, but in the kitchen, anew. Resolve simmered behind the swinging door. Paul hovered just beyond the Rivera table, hands clasped before him. The candles cast soft shadows across his face, and for the first time that evening, he felt their full weight. He watched Marco swirl the last of his wine, Elena quietly brushing a stray hair behind her ear, Sophia tracing patterns in the tablecloth, and Diego lifting a spoonful of sorbet with slow precision. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He could still feel the sting of Marco's steady gaze, the hush that fell over the room when he called out Paul's name. He had believed his own assumptions, let them guide his actions, and now he understood how deeply they had wounded. His uniform felt heavier than usual, the fabric sticking to his skin beneath the restaurant's warmth. He remembered his chef's words, to serve food, not prejudice. There had been so many chances to correct himself. A simple smile, an extra pour of water, genuine eye contact. But he had let fear and bias build a wall between him and the family. Paul took a breath and stepped forward. Clearing his throat, he spoke softly. Mrs. Rivera, Mr. Rivera, I owe you an apology. Elena looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. Marco's posture was alert but open. I let my own judgments affect the way I treated you tonight. Paul continued, voice unsteady. I'm sorry for the way I spoke and the way I served. You deserved warmth and respect. Everything I failed to give. Elena's shoulders relaxed, and Sophia peered over with a hopeful expression. Diego's grip on his spoon loosened. Paul pressed on. I've spoken with my team, and I promise to do better. If there's anything I could do to make this right, please let me know. Marco offered a small nod. Thank you for owning that, he said quietly. We appreciate the apology. Paul bowed his head. May I bring anything else? More wine, perhaps another dessert on the house. He gestured toward the dessert menu. Elena exchanged a glance with Marco. She smiled gently. That will be very kind. Paul turned, heart lighter, and returned to fetch their requests. As he moved away, he resolved to carry this lesson forward, to serve not just food, but dignity to every guest, every time. And in that choice, he found hope that actions, however late, could still restore what was nearly lost. Just as Paul returned with a fresh bottle of Malbec, a loud crash echoed from the kitchens. Swinging doors, pots clanged, and the line cook shouted. Diners glanced up, murmurs rippling. Through the room, Chef Laurent burst through, face flushed. Service, he called, voice taut. We have a power outage in the kitchen. Everyone switched to backup prep stations. He disappeared behind the doors as they flapped open and closed. Paul froze, wine uncorked in his hand. Elena looked toward the kitchen, concern etched on her face. Marco rose, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's okay, he murmured. A hostess hurried past, whispering to a waitress that dinner service might be delayed. The piano. Music halted, and the soft glow of the chandeliers flickered. The dining room plunged into semi-darkness, candlelight now their sole illumination. Tables shifted closer to the windows, the night outside suddenly visible through large panes. Sophia reached for her mother's hand. What's happening? She asked in a small voice. Diego's eyes darted around, as if expecting something more dramatic. Elena squeezed Sophia's hand. Just a hiccup, sweetheart. Paul hurried back, setting down the wine. I'm sorry, he said, voice low. They're working on it. He gestured to a cluster of staff near the kitchen, their faces lit by the glow of smartphones. Without power, the chef's special lamb shank had to be finished on a portable burner. Steam billowed as line cooks rushed to adjust flame and temperature. A waiter dropped a tray, sending plates twisting before they clattered onto the floor. Gasps rose from the nearest tables. Paul knelt to help gather broken china, murmuring apologies to startled guests. Marco and Elena exchanged looks, concern mingled with compassion. Let me help, Marco offered, rising from his seat. But Paul shook his head, flustered but determined. I'll handle it. Nearby servers formed a chain, passing dishes by hand from kitchen to table. The Rivera family watched as the staff rallied, faces set with resolve. The disruption had scattered the evenings. Calm, yet in the glow of candlelight and shared effort, a new warmth kindled. Elena lifted her glass toward Chef Laurent, who had emerged to oversee. Laurent returned the gesture with a nod. Sophia and Diego smiled tentatively. In that moment, the restaurant felt less like a stage and more like a community, fallible, human, and together. Soft murmurs drifted from neighboring tables as diners put down forks and leaned forward. Curiosity piqued by the earlier commotion. At a corner table, an older couple exchanged glances. The woman's lips parted as though to speak. Then she shook her head, offering only a sympathetic smile to the Riveras. Across the aisle, a trio of business travelers dined in silence, their half-finished pasta untouched. One man tipped his head toward Marco, eyes conveying apology without words. His companion raised an eyebrow, then, voice low, remarked to his friend, they don't deserve that treatment. The friend nodded, eyes flicking to Paul as he rushed past. A family of four, seated near the window, had paused their hushed conversation. The mother's gaze lingered on Elena, and she gave a small, encouraging nod before returning to tuck a napkin into her son's collar. Their daughter watched Sophia and offered a discreet thumbs up before her. Parents gently shushed her, wary of drawing attention. At the chef's table, a pair of food critics in crisp suits and notepads closed them slowly. The critic with spectacles leaned toward his colleague, whispering, "I came for the tasting menu, but now I'm watching the real drama." His companion exhaled, setting aside a pen. "Hospitality isn't just about flavor," he murmured. "It's about respect." A group of friends at the bar, champagne flutes in hand, paused mid-toast. One tapped her glass, catching Paul's eye, and offered a subtle, "I've got your back." The others echoed with soft clinks, their solidarity unspoken but palpable. Meanwhile, some diners stared without understanding, brows furrowed as they tried to piece together the uneven service and sudden blackout. Phones appeared in hands, screens, illuminating faces intent on capturing the moment. A hush fell as though the entire room had agreed to witness what would come next. Elena noticed the shifting atmosphere, the undercurrent of support weaving among strangers. She met Marco's gaze and, without words, found courage in their shared silence. The Riveras raised their glasses in a quiet salute to those who offered kindness from afar, reminding them that even in a room that had turned cold, warmth could bloom where empathy took root. Diego's spoon clattered against his plate, drawing every eye. He pushed back from the table, face flushed. "Enough," he cried, voice ringing through the hush. Guests froze mid conversation, forks hovered in the air. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Marco rose, heart pounding, but held back, giving Diego space. The boy's small frame trembled with anger. "Why do you treat us like we're invisible?" he demanded, voice quivering. "Why do you think we don't belong?" Paul, carrying a tray, paused as though struck. The plates in his hands clinked softly. Around them, tension crackled. Some diners gasped. Others leaned forward, curiosity and empathy mingling in their expressions. Diego's eyes blazed. "We came here to celebrate my dad's big promotion. We didn't ask for special treatment, just kindness." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, tears pooling at his lashes. The restaurant's polished ambience felt fragile under his words. A couple nearby exchanged troubled glances. A waitress stopped mid-step, eyes wide. Even Chef Laurent peered from the kitchen's threshold, brow furrowed. Elena rose and crossed to her son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Diego," she whispered, voice soft but firm. Diego shook off the touch and wiped his cheek. He looked at the other diners, faces turned toward him, some sympathetic, some startled. Marco approached, kneeling beside Diego. "Son," he said quietly, "you spoke your truth." Diego's breath came fast. Marco looked up at Paul, who stood frozen. "You hear him?" Marco said, voice steady. "He deserves respect." Paul's gaze shifted from Diego to the assembled diners. His grip on the tray loosened. He edged closer to the Rivera table, eyes downcast. A murmur rippled through the room, comforting, supportive. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded tissue, offering it to Diego. He accepted it, clutching it like a lifeline. Diego exhaled, shoulders slumping as adrenaline ebbed. The restaurant held its breath, waiting. In that charged silence, his outburst had pierced the facade of refinement, laying bare a simple truth. Every person, regardless of background, deserves to belong. And tonight, that truth resonated louder than any polite applause. Marco set his jaw and met Elena's eyes. With a measured breath, he rose and called, "Mrs. Langley, please." Murmurs rippled as heads turned toward the Rivera table. From the far end of the dining room, Mrs. Langley paused mid-conversation with a patron and walked toward them, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She approached with professional grace, offering a practiced smile. "Good evening," she said, voice smooth. "Is there an issue I can help with?" Marco gestured to the table. "Yes, our family has experienced treatment that contradicts the hospitality your establishment promotes. We'd like your attention, please." Mrs. Langley's smile faltered for a heartbeat. She glanced at Paul standing nearby, arms folded. Then she looked back at Marco, her expression composed. "I'm sorry you feel that way." "What?" specifically has occurred? Elena spoke first, voice calm. Our waiter made us feel unwelcome. Water was withheld, wine. Recommendations denied, and unkind words were spoken. My son even felt compelled to speak out. She nodded toward Diego, who sat holding his mother's hand. Mrs. Langley's lips pressed together. She offered a polite nod. I understand, she said, tone careful. I apologize for any oversight. Behind her, staff had gathered inconspicuously, watching. Marco unfolded his napkin and stood straighter. An apology is welcome, he said, but we seek assurance that respect and fairness will guide the remainder of our evening. She exhaled softly, eyes flicking to the surrounding diners whose attention lingered on the exchange. Of course, she replied. I will personally ensure you receive the service you deserve. She turned to Paul. Paul, please attend to the Rivera family and rectify any lapses. Immediately, Paul stepped forward, voice tentative. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Langley returned her focus to the Riveras. May I offer a complimentary course or dessert while we make arrangements? Elena exchanged a glance with Marco before nodding. Thank you. That would be appreciated. Mrs. Langley gave a curt bow. Allow me a moment to speak with the team. As she strode away, the Rivera family sat quietly. Their request had been heard. Attention had shifted from discomfort to resolution. Around them, the restaurant's atmosphere, once cold and fractured, began to thaw under the promise of genuine accountability. Mrs. Langley returned to the center of the dining room, composed and resolute. She addressed the assembled staff in a firm, clear voice. It has come to my attention there's been a misunderstanding regarding Table 12, she began, glancing briefly at the Riveras. I want to be perfectly clear. La Bellevue does not discriminate. Elena met Marco's eyes, searching hers for sincerity. Mrs. Langley continued, if any of you felt uncomfortable tonight, I apologize, but there was no intent to single out this family. She swept her gaze over the waitstaff, who shifted uneasily. Paul stiffened, jaw clenched. Mr. Rivera rose slightly, studying the owner's face. With all due respect, Mrs. Langley, Marco said, voice steady. Intent doesn't erase impact. Our experience was real. Mrs. Langley's lips pressed together, and she held her posture. Understand your feelings, she replied coolly, but I've reviewed security footage and spoken to the maitre d'. There's no evidence any inappropriate comments were made. She offered a polite nod as though concluding the matter. Sophia inhaled sharply. Diego's hand tightened around his fork. Elena cleared her throat. We don't need video, she said quietly. We experienced it. A hush fell over the room as other diners watched the exchange. Mrs. Langley's expression flickered, frustration or disbelief, and she took a measured breath. I'm sorry you felt unwelcome, she said, voice flat, but I cannot apologize for actions that did not occur. Marco's throat tightened. Then I ask you to trust us and to discipline any staff who behaved unprofessionally. Mrs. Langley's gaze hardened. I will speak with my team, she said finally, but unless there's proof beyond subjective claims, there will be no formal action. She turned on her heel, dismissing the family without waiting for a response. The staff exchanged awkward glances. The Riveras sat stunned. An apology offered, then retracted. Elena closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. Marco reached across and covered her hand with his. Sophia looked down, and Diego's lip trembled. In that moment, the restaurant's refined veneer cracked. Mrs. Langley's denial echoed louder than any apology, leaving the Rivera family to weigh their dignity against an owner's unwillingness to admit fault. Soft murmurs began to ripple through the dining room as Mrs. Langley's heels clicked away. At a nearby table, the business traveler with spectacles leaned forward, voice low but firm. Did you hear that? Unbelievable. His companion closed his notepad with a quiet snap and shook his head. The older couple exchanged uneasy looks. The woman pursed her lips, then whispered, I Suppose that's her prerogative, but her tone betrayed doubt. A father at a family table glanced toward his wife, eyebrows raised. Their young daughter looked at Sophia and gave a sympathetic smile before returning to her plate. Behind the bar, the bartender dried a glass and exchanged a glance with the hostess. The hostess shrugged with a tight smile, her eyes flicking toward the Rivera table. The bartender murmured that wasn't right. Across the aisle, the trio of diners in business casual posture muttered among themselves. One said, "We came here for the food, but this is food for thought." His friend replied, "Yeah, hospitality starts with listening." They each raised their glasses in a subtle salute to the Riveras. Paul, at the service station, overheard the dissent and paused, heart pounding. He locked eyes with a line cook who silently mouthed, "I'm sorry." The kitchen door swayed, and Chef Laurent stepped out, arms folded. His gaze swept over the room, landing on the owner's empty spot by the staff station. He returned inside, the door swinging shut on muffled frustration. In the far corner, a young couple with smartphones tucked away exchanged a look. The woman reached over to squeeze her partner's hand. "We need to say something," she whispered. He nodded, eyes solemn. Elena felt the shift in the air, the collective empathy for her family growing louder in the hush. She caught Sophia's eye and offered a small, grateful smile. Sophia returned it with a nod, confidence blooming. The restaurant's decor, pristine tables, polished silver, seemed less important now than the conversations rising in quiet insistence. Whispers of dissent threaded through the space. Murmurs of solidarity, questions of principle, a dawning sense that respect could not be denied indefinitely. In their wake, the Riveras sat poised, no longer isolated victims, but the focal point of a moral reckoning unfolding around them. A hush fell as a tall figure rose from a corner table. He wore simple jeans and a well-worn leather jacket, his presence calm yet unmistakable. Conversations tapered off as diners turned to watch him walk toward the Rivera family. Elena's breath caught. Marco rose instinctively, hand brushing the back of his chair. Sophia clutched Diego's arm. At the front of the restaurant stood Chuck Norris, his gray eyes steady and unruffled. He offered only a small nod to Mrs. Langley, who froze at the sight of him. Chuck approached the table with deliberate steps, the swish of his boots soft on the tile. He reached the Rivera family's table and paused beside Marco. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, voice low but commanding. Marco managed a surprised smile. "Of course," he replied, shaking Chuck's hand. Paul stepped forward, guilt and relief flickering across his face. Chuck glanced at him, then at the Riveras. "I saw what happened," he said, tone even. "No one here deserves disrespect." His words carried across the room, drawing every gaze. Chuck pulled out a chair, sat down beside Sophia, and offered her a reassuring smile. "How's the cake tasting?" he asked quietly. Sophia blinked in surprise, then grinned. "Delicious," she whispered. Diego's posture relaxed, and he nodded. Elena cleared her throat. "Mr. Norris, thank you." Chuck shook his head. "Call me Chuck," he said, voice gentle. "Families belong together, and guests belong here." He looked to Mrs. Langley, who stood frozen near the podium. Across the room, staff and diners alike watched as Chuck's quiet solidarity rippled outward. The bartender leaned forward, a waitress stood straighter, and even Chef Laurent peeked through the kitchen door. The restaurant's warmth slowly returned. Chuck raised his glass. "To respect," he said simply. Glasses around the room chimed in echo. The unexpected ally had spoken, and in his wake, silence transformed into a collective promise. Tonight, dignity would be restored. Chuck leaned forward, elbows resting on the table's edge as he let his gaze sweep the room. "Mrs. Langley," he said, voice calm but carrying enough weight to hush nearby conversations. "I'd like to understand why your staff felt at liberty to tell any family they don't belong here." Mrs. Langley swallowed and straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Norris," she began, voice quivering slightly, I assure you there was no malice intended. Chuck nodded slowly. Intent is not the point. Impact matters. My daughter and her family felt unwelcome. That happened under your roof. Why? Her eyes flicked to Paul, who stood behind her looking ashamed. Then back to Chuck. It was an individual failing, she said, voice low. A misunderstanding I regret. Chuck's expression remained steady. What measures will you take to ensure this doesn't recur? Because an apology, while necessary, only means something when actions follow. She inhaled, glancing at the assembled staff and diners whose eyes lingered on her. I will hold training sessions on cultural sensitivity, she replied. I will reprimand and retrain any staff found to be discriminatory, and I will personally oversee future service to ensure fairness. Chuck's gaze softened slightly as he regarded Elena and Marco. That's a start, he said, but actions speak louder than words. Your team needs to see that respect is non-negotiable. He turned to Paul. Do you agree? Paul stepped forward, chin lifted. Yes, sir, he said. I failed tonight, but I intend to learn. I'll lead by example. Chuck nodded and looked back to Mrs. Langley. Then hold them to it. Make them earn back trust. The room held its breath as she met his gaze and inclined her head. Chuck sat back and turned to the Rivera family. Are you all right? He asked gently. Elena offered a grateful smile. Better now, she said. As Chuck's inquiry laid bare the restaurant's obligation, the air shifted from tension to accountability. The promise of real change hung in the candlelit room, stronger than any apology alone. The clink of glasses had faded, leaving a profound hush that settled over La Bellevue. Every diner held their breath, eyes drifting between the Rivera family and Chuck Norris, whose presence still radiated quiet authority. Mrs. Langley stood motionless near the staff station, shoulders squared, as though bracing herself for what came next. In that silence, the ambient sounds of the restaurant, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant drip of a faucet seemed amplified. A lone candle flickered on the Rivera table, its dancing flame casting elongated shadows across polished wood and linen. Elena gripped Marco's hand beneath the table, their joined fingers the only movement in sight. Paul hovered nearby, tray forgotten at his side. He watched Chuck's steady gaze, then lowered his eyes toward the floor, shame and resolve warring in his expression. The staff clustered near the kitchen door, stood in respectful stillness, their earlier mutters extinguished by the gravity of the moment. At the bar, the bartender ceased polishing glasses. A patron cleared his throat, then refrained from speaking. The family at the window leaned forward, faces impassive but attentive. Not a soul moved to refill, to murmur, or to break the solemn pause. Moments stretched, fragile and weighty. Chuck shifted slightly in his chair, eyes sweeping the room one final time. He rose, his stature commanding yet devoid of arrogance, and nodded once to Mrs. Langley. The single gesture carried both expectation and warning. Mrs. Langley inhaled and exhaled, the sound sharp in the quiet. She stepped toward the Rivera table, smoothing her jacket. We will make this right, she said, voice low but firm. The words, simple and direct, reverberated through the room like a promise. Slowly, like ripples spreading across still water, movement returned. Paul knelt to refill Elena's glass. A waitress tucked a strained napkin at the next table. Diners shifted in their seats, conversation creeping back in hushed tones. The piano resumed softly in the corner, and the lights hummed as power flowed steadily once more. But the silence that had bound every guest and staff member lingered beneath the restored ambience, a shared memory of a moment when respect demanded attention and the weight of unspoken understanding filled an entire room. Mrs. Langley stood before the Rivera table, shoulders squared but gaze earnest. The murmur of resumed conversations softened as diners sensed the significance of this moment. Clearing her throat, she spoke, voice steady yet conveying genuine remorse. Mr. and Mrs. Rivera, Sophia, Diego, I owe you a heartfelt apology. Elena lifted her chin, meeting the owner's eyes. Marco sat tall beside her, arms uncrossed. Mrs. Langley continued, earlier this evening, my staff failed you. They allowed prejudice and assumption to cloud their judgment, exactly what La Belle stands against. She paused, letting the words settle. I failed too, she admitted. As the owner, it was my responsibility to ensure every guest feels welcome and respected. I fell short in listening and in action. She drew a deep breath. For that, I'm truly sorry. Paul, standing nearby in his crisp uniform, bowed his head. Mrs. Langley gestured toward him. This is Paul, our senior waiter. He has apologized and committed to retraining and to setting a better example for our team. Paul met the family's gaze, voice quiet but sincere. I will work every day to earn back your trust. Mrs. Langley addressed the room, her voice carrying to every corner. To our guests, I apologize for the distress caused. You expect a certain standard here, and I promise to uphold it. The staff, lined along the wall, nodded in unison. Breath caught around the dining room as they witnessed accountability in action. Elena exchanged a glance with Marco, then offered a small, forgiving smile. Sophia relaxed, and Diego allowed the tension to leave his shoulders. Mrs. Langley motioned to a server who delivered a plate of complimentary desserts, tres leches cake for Sophia and fruit sorbet for Diego, just as they had hoped. Mrs. Langley concluded, please allow us to restore your evening. You deserve nothing less. She stepped back, inviting the staff to serve with renewed purpose. As Paul gently poured more wine for Marco, the Rivera family felt the warmth return, not just from the restored service, but from the courage it took for one person to admit fault and lead a team toward genuine change. Paul stood by the side station, sleeves rolled to his elbows, heart pounding. He watched as Mrs. Langley delivered her apology, every word sinking in like a weight lifting. His shoulders, once hunched with guilt, straightened as he prepared to face the Rivera family again. He stepped forward, tray in hand, and approached the table with measured steps. Diego and Sophia looked up, curiosity mingled with lingering unease. Marco and Elena waited, patient but watchful. Paul took a breath, voice steady. Mr. and Mrs. Rivera, Sophia, Diego, he began, meeting each of their eyes in turn. I owe you more than an apology from the owner. He set the tray down and uncorked a fresh bottle of Malbec. The click of the cork punctuated the hush that fell over the table. I allowed my own assumptions to guide my actions, he continued. I spoke words I can never take back, and I withheld the kindness you deserved. He poured a small taste for Marco, then for Elena, Sophia, and Diego. I want to make amends, he said, lifting his glass slightly. To show you respect is not just policy, it's personal. The family accepted the wine, the gesture bridging the distance his prejudice had created. Paul's gaze lingered on Diego, who offered a tentative nod, and on Sophia, whose eyes held cautious hope. I've arranged for your remaining courses to be on the house, he said, voice humble, and I will personally oversee every detail of your service tonight. He paused, swallowing hard. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I needed more than I knew. The table remained silent for a heartbeat, the sincerity of his words resonating in the soft glow of candlelight. Elena reached out and placed her hand over his. Thank you, Paul, she said, her voice warm. We appreciate your honesty. Across the room, other diners watched as the once divided space healed around a single act of accountability. Paul returned to the station, shoulders lighter, carrying the promise of better service. In that moment, amid the clink of glasses and the scent of melting sorbet, he understood that a waiter's true duty was not merely to serve food, but to honor the dignity of every guest. A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the Rivera table as the last forkfuls of dessert were savored. Elena leaned back, the tension in her shoulders melting away like the sorbet on her tongue. Marco reached across and took her hand, their fingers entwined in quiet reassurance. Sophia sat upright, eyes bright as she smiled at her mother. "This cake is the best I've ever had," she said softly. Diego nodded, face lighting up as Paul refilled his glass. Their laughter, gentle and genuine, filled the space once heavy with unease. Elena glanced around the dining room. Diners engaged in renewed conversation, staff moving with attentive care, and felt a warm swell of gratitude. "We can finally enjoy our celebration," she murmured to Marco. He squeezed her hand and smiled, pride shining in his eyes. Sophia set down her fork and sighed happily. "I'm so glad we stayed," she said. Diego leaned forward, excitedly pointing out the window at the city lights. The family's earlier hesitance had crumbled, replaced by relief and reclaiming of the evening they had come to share. Paul appeared beside their table, dipping into a respectful bow. "Is there anything else I can bring?" he asked, voice sincere and light. Elena shook her head, smile warm. "Just your excellent service," she replied. Paul's nod carried the earnest promise of his commitment. Marco raised his glass, catching Chuck Norris's eye from across the room. Chuck returned the gesture with a small nod before returning to his own dinner. The Rivera family raised their glasses in a silent toast to resilience, to understanding, and to the unexpected ally who had joined them. As the evening drew toward its close, the restaurant's soft lighting and gentle music felt like a cocoon of shared experience. The sting of earlier slights had faded, replaced by the warmth of apologies kept and promises made. Elena rested her head against Marco's shoulder. "Thank you for standing by me," she whispered. He kissed her temple. "Always." Sophia and Diego leaned in, closing the circle of family. In that moment, relief settled over them like a comforting blanket, proof that even the coldest welcome could be thawed by courage, compassion, and the simple act of belonging. Glasses filled with a deep ruby red rested in the hands of the Rivera family as they prepared to offer a final salute to the evening's unexpected journey. Marco caught Elena's eye and raised his glass slightly. Around them, the soft murmur of renewed service provided a gentle backdrop. Elena lifted her glass higher and addressed the small circle of staff gathered near their table, Paul, Chef Laurent peeking from the kitchen, and even Mrs. Langley standing unobtrusively at the edge. "To unity," she said, voice clear and warm. "May respect and compassion guide us all." Sophia and Diego followed suit, clinking their glasses gently against their parents. Sophia's smile was radiant, her earlier worry replaced by confidence. Diego looked around at the watching staff and diners, his young face alight with hope. Paul stepped forward and tapped his glass against his wine bottle, catching Elena's eye. "Too, learning and growing," he added, voice earnest. "Thank you for your patience and for reminding me why service is about heart as much as skill." Chef Laurent emerged fully from the kitchen, carrying a small tray of delicate petit fours. He set it before the family, then lifted his own glass. "To food that brings people together," he said, and his broad nod carried both respect and solidarity. Mrs. Langley, standing near the back, stepped closer and raised her glass. "To accountability," she said, tone genuine, "and to the courage it takes to face our own shortcomings." Her words resonated through the room, drawing appreciative glances from other diners. Even the bartender paused behind the bar to lift his glass in a silent cheer. The pianist resumed, a soft melody, and the restaurant's atmosphere shimmered with a newly forged camaraderie. Marco looked at each member of his family and then back at the gathered staff. "Tonight we were strangers," he said, "but through honesty and understanding, we've become a community." He drank deeply, the wine's warmth echoing the unity they celebrated. Elena and the children clinked their glasses one last time, the sound bright and hopeful. In that shared moment, between apologies and reconciliation, between service and solidarity, the evening's true feast was revealed, a toast not merely to wine, but to the power of coming together as equals. The Rivera family rose from the table, gathering their things as the restaurant's lights dimmed. For evening service, Elena smoothed her shawl and looked around, noting the attentive smiles from staff who once offered only coldness. Marco stepped beside her, and Sophia and Diego clung to either side, excitement mingling with relief in their eyes. As they made their way toward the exit, Paul appeared with a small envelope. Handing it to Marco, he nodded. Inside, they found personalized gift cards and a handwritten note. Thank you for teaching us what true hospitality means. Marco paused in the doorway to address the assembled staff. Your kindness tonight won't be forgotten, he said, voice resonant. Mrs. Langley emerged and offered a sincere smile. Safe travels, she said, her tone free of pretense. We look forward to serving you again. Elena returned the smile, warmth shining in her eyes. We'll be back, she promised. Outside, the cool night air felt crisp and renewing. The city lights glimmered overhead as the family paused on the sidewalk. Diego hugged his mother tight and whispered, "That was the best night ever, despite everything." Sophia looked up at her father. "I felt seen," she said softly. Marco lifted them both into a hug and surveyed the quiet street. Tonight showed us that one